Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 21st of October of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important, probably interesting updates are coming, as usually these days, from Avdiivka direction. The Russians continue their offensive operation trying to penetrate the first defense belt between Krasnogorovka and Stepova, and basically the main purpose of the Russians currently is to establish 100% control over the Terikon or the waste heap, and to get and to capture the railways. So this is the main purpose of the Russians for this stage of offensive operation. This is the territory that the Russians want to capture, and if the Russians can do this, if the Russians can force the Ukrainians to step on the left side of this yellow line, then we can start counting days before entire Avdiivka will fall. Because before that, before forcing the Ukrainians on the left side of this yellow river, there are still high chances that Ukrainians can hold Avdiivka and basically can defeat the Russians in this offensive operation. Today, the Ukrainian forces, to be more precise, the 110th Mechanized Brigade, this is the main forces in this area, this is the base of Ukrainian defense belt in this area, published another video of a Russian attempt to storm the territory. Of course, this video was made by the Ukrainian forces, so that's why we won't see like a very powerful attack successes from the Russian side. The only thing we're gonna see is significant number of Russian losses and significant very heavy explosions, destroyed armored vehicles, destroyed tanks. But though when talking about this video, there were a few very important moments that we need to pay attention to. And the first important moment and important scene is this one. Currently, in front of your eyes, we can see the Russian progress, the Russian geolocated progress. On this scene, we can see how the Russians managed to get the northern edge of the waste heap, and that how the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russians with artillery systems. Basically, according to this geolocation, we will move to the map. The Russians managed to advance and to capture more tree lines. According to the Russian sources, and without, of course, any geolocated confirmation, the Russians have already established control over the waste heap, but military summary, we don't want to change this territory. Currently, we think that waste heap is in the gray zone, or at least in the Ukraine control. But according to geolocated video, according to the video that was published by the Ukrainians, as a result of offensive operation, there are very high chances that the Russians managed to establish control over this territory. This is not so much, obviously this is very small progress, but when talking about the battles like Avdiivka or Rabotyne or Verbovo or Bakhmut, every single square meter is very important. Very important, and this is another square meters that the Russians managed to capture, and if even they haven't established control over the waste heap, by this progress they managed to get a little bit closer to come to successful complete of this mission. Furthermore, the Russians during the previous night, were bombing the Avdiivka heavily. On this video, we can see the explosions and fire on the chemical plant that located right in front of the waste heap Terikon and right in front of Russian offensive operation. The Russian artillery forces, aviation completely focused just on this territory because this is an industrial area. Let's zoom in. As you can see, there is a lot of buildings, a lot of facilities. Obviously, there are a lot of underground facilities that Ukrainians use. As I understand, probably maybe up to 5,000 soldiers are concentrated just in this area underground. Significant number of reserves, of ammo depots, of warehouses that Ukrainians use to repel the Russian attacks. So the battle for this area is going to be very difficult. But as we discussed, as soon as Russians capture just this territory, the entire battle of Avdiivka will be resolved. It's going to be just a question of time when exactly the final square meters will be captured by the Russians. So the Russians took a decision to attack exactly with one strike in the most important position and to solve the entire battle for Avdiivka just with one victory, just with one small clashes on one small part of this area. Furthermore, the Western sources are saying that the Russians started using very interesting tactics. We saw a lot of geolocated videos how the Russian armored vehicles were destroyed as a result of artillery strikes, that the Russians currently don't have possibilities to get very close to the combat line, to Ukrainian trenches because of cluster rounds and so on. So the Russians took a decision to create tunnels, to dig tunnels. Of course, it is a very long process, obviously, but we saw such a tactics in Syria. We saw such a tactics in the Middle East when the like ISIS forces and like a lot of forces trying to become invisible for Russian like aviation, for Russian drones, were creating tunnels, and that was the only way how they could make progress. So the Russians currently took a decision to make the same thing. They're building tunnels. It's a very long process, obviously, but as we understand, maybe the battle for Avdiivka is going to take place for months, and obviously during the next few months they will be able to create a lot of tunnels from, let's say, Krasnogorovka itself, for example, to the, let's say, the railways, or even closer and even inside of the Avdiivka chemical plant. So this is the tactic that the Russians are planning to use, and maybe this will help them to save people, to save manpower, and not to die under very heavy Ukrainian fire with cluster rounds and different types of weapon. Furthermore, the sources are saying that Ukrainians started concentration of their forces on the line between Nitailova, Karlovka, Pervomayskaya, and Ukrainians are trying to concentrate their armored fist, and the main purpose of this concentration is to attack the Russians in their flank and trying to change their focus, to force the Russians to change their focus on the western flank and to slow the Russian progress on the north. So this is something like a solution that Ukrainians try to implement. The Russians obviously control and see everything. They attack this territory regularly using artillery systems, aviation bombs, and so on. And as a result of strikes, the Ukrainians had losses, obviously. On the north of Vadiana, the Russians published the video how, as a result of FPV drone strike, the Russians managed to damage and destroy another Ukrainian tank. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes in this area, on Donetsk front line, the Ukrainians lost 260 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems. Another problem that Ukrainians faced during the previous days is significant number of losses among their aviation. As we discussed just the day before, the Ukrainians lost up to 9 aircrafts just for one day, and every single day the Ukrainians are losing helicopters, aviation, and so on. Su-24, Su-25, the Ukrainians lost MiG-29, and the main reason of that is that the Russians started using long-range missile that can attack within 400 kilometers, and furthermore the Russians start using aviation heavily in Avdiivka, and the Russians start using aviation heavily in Kherson area. So that's why the Ukrainians try to use MiG-29 to shut down the Russian aviations. But as we can see, the Ukrainians try to shut down the Russians, but basically the Russians are shutting down the Ukrainian aviation since the beginning of like special military operation. When talking about South Donetsk direction, we also got some updates from this territory. There were no clashes in Novomikhailivka, no clashes in Vadiana or Glidar, just regular artillery duels. But as a result of artillery duels, the Russians managed to destroy a significant number of Ukrainian artillery systems. And the Russians, for example, in this video destroyed few mortar systems. As a result, there were few like strikes. The Russians trying to coordinate and correct their artillery systems, and usually on the third strike, the Russians were able to destroy this or that artillery system. Furthermore, as an act of revenge, as an act of anger, or I don't know how to call this, the Ukrainians, because they see the entire situation, the South Donetsk and Avdiivka area, they see that no matter the Russian losses, they see that the Russians probably have something like endless reserves, endless forces to continue offensive operation, which we can't say the same about the Ukrainians. So that's why the Ukrainians started bombing and attacking the capital of DPR with cluster rounds and with HIMARS. Significant number of HIMARS the Ukrainians launched against the city. A lot of those HIMARS rockets were shot down by the Russian air defense systems. Some sources are saying that some Ukrainian HIMARS missiles were shot down by the electronic warfare equipment and so on. We don't have any reports regarding the losses, but the Ukrainians, the most important, were attacking residential area with HIMARS with cluster rounds. I don't know how to explain the situation. The only things that comes to my mind is that it's just the act of revenge and act of anger of people who understand that they will lose the battle for Avdiivka, and the only thing they can do is to do a lot of bad things for the civilians and population of Donetsk. So this is the only explanation I see. But one more time, we don't have the numbers of the losses of the Russian and civilians in this area as a result of those strikes. When talking about Avdiivka tactical bridgehead, we haven't received nothing from this area, probably for the first time since the beginning since the creation of this front line. There were no aviation bombings, there were no guided bombs, so probably the Russians currently are focused on Avdiivka and they use every single free aviation in that direction. They're not attacking Rabotyne anymore. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on the South Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 140 soldiers and 3 armored vehicles. And as you can see, there were no losses among the artillery systems. So maybe that means something. When talking about Rabotyne area, today we got a lot of updates, but we have some updates from the ground, as you can see on these videos, and we have some updates from the Ministry of Defense, and the numbers completely are not correlate with each other. For example, on this video we see how the Ukrainians tried to land their infantry somewhere in the vicinity of Verbova for further offensive operation, or probably storming operation of the village, but the Russians attacked the Ukrainian convoy with anti-tank missile, and as a result of those strikes the Ukrainians had losses. They lost few armored vehicles and probably some number of soldiers. But the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, for example, reported that as a result of clashes on Zaporozhye area, the Ukrainians lost just 20 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, including 2 tanks and 3 artillery systems. And when talking about geolocations we had, then the level of losses should be much higher, but for some reason we see just like very low numbers. Very heavy clashes are taking place currently on the line between Kupiansk and Novodanilovka, and this is the area where the Ukrainians try to concentrate their forces, and we can make a very bad conclusions, like not very good things for the Russians in this area. And I mentioned one important thing. For example, if we increase the number of days from 13th of October, we're gonna see the most important battle that took place in this area. Maybe not, maybe on the 12th of October. Yes, on the 12th of October, the Ukrainians managed to capture the territory. We saw the video, the Ukrainian offensive operation with 1 tank, 1 armored personnel carrier with infantry, and as a result of attack, the Ukrainians managed first to suppress the Russian defense belt to force the Russian forces to retreat, and after that, the Ukrainian infantry cleared the territory. So that was like a very short and expected operation that brought the Ukrainians significant success. That operation took place somewhere on the 13th of October. Today is 21st of October, and today we got completely different videos. We got the video how the Ukrainians completely fill the trenches with the manpower. Significant number of infantry, hundreds, maybe even thousands of soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers currently located on the trenches that even a week ago used to be under Russian control. So the Ukrainians are very fast if they need to capture territory, if they need to fill the trenches with manpower and forces. And as we can see, according to these geolocations, the Ukrainians have concentrated significant number of forces on this yellow line, and the Ukrainians probably are ready for further offensive operation in direction of Kupiansk. And this is exactly what we're going to see the next maybe even 48 hours. The Russians, of course, see the entire situation. They attack and bomb the Ukrainians, but the Russians have one problem. The Russians are not using cluster rounds so massively as the Ukrainians do. The Ukrainians do attack the Russians with cluster rounds every single second. And this is like a perfect weapon against the manpower. And when talking about the Russians, I don't remember. There was a few cases, but not so many cases in comparison with the Ukrainians. Maybe the Russians are trying to keep cluster rounds for some like extra time and for some extra operation. But the thing is that this extra operation might never start. So this is the main problem. When talking about Kherson direction, we haven't received almost nothing from this area, just the situation in Berislav. The Russians continue bombing the city with guided bombs, and maybe the reason why the level of attacks and the number of bombings of this territory with guided bombs reduced is that the Russians currently focus all their aviation artillery on Avdiivka direction. So maybe this is the reason. And from one side, this is very good for Avdiivka, but from the other side, we understand that this is the best time for the Ukrainians to continue their offensive operation, because according to information we have, the Russians still haven't managed to force the Ukrainians to step back from Krynki. This part of the village still under Ukrainian control. The Russians are bombing and attacking this territory heavily with just artillery systems, with mortars, but yet the Russians haven't started even a single storm operation. Maybe the Russians are afraid of, maybe the Russians don't want to have unnecessary losses during the storm operation, because obviously there are going to be losses during the clearing operation. So that's why the Russians took a decision first to suppress this area with artillery and to try to force the Ukrainians to step back under the very heavy artillery fire. But every single second, every single minute means for the Ukrainians another digging deeper, another trenches, another fortifications, and more reserves that comes from the Ukrainian bank of the river. When talking about the Dachi and Pridniprovska, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions along the railways. Currently, there are no progress, no activity in this area, just regular artillery duels and bombings of the possible Ukrainian foothold in this area. Very interesting updates are coming from Kupiansk direction, there is a Russian progress. There is a very big, important Russian progress. Some Western sources like Syriac maps confirm that the Russians managed to establish control over this forest line, and later we got the video from the Ukrainian sources. The Ukrainians published the video how the Ukrainian soldiers managed to destroy Russian tank as a result of a launch of anti-tank missile. So this is geolocated video, and the most important is that as a result of the strike, the Russian tank was damaged or even destroyed probably, but that was an empty tank. The infantry has already landed on this area, and the Ukrainian soldier was located in this forest, and he was attacking the Russian tank in this area. So as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to establish control not just over the northern forest, over this part on the west of Liman Perve, but also the Russians managed to establish a small foothold, let's say on the Ukrainian side of these fields, and start clearing operation in this area. So this is the Russian progress. The Russians continue their offensive operation, and probably we're going to see more updates in these forests, and the Russians are moving further to the south in direction of Kupiansk, and obviously some Russian forces will turn to the west, southwest, and will attack Sinkovka from this area as well. The Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of clashes on Kupiansk and Liman direction, the Ukrainians lost 150 soldiers. As you can see, the level of losses is normal for this area, is not so big and isn't so low in comparison with the most inactive days on these front lines. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.